Hello, my name is Shane Larango, and I love stories. Whether I write them or live them, perform them, listen to them, or talk about them, I was born for storytelling. Today, I want to welcome my friend Rachel Ann Harding. And I actually became acquainted with her through her podcast before I actually met her or knew her personally. And the podcast is called Story Podcast, and I highly recommend it. Next, I actually got to meet her in person at the 2018 Texas Storytelling Festival when we were connected through another storyteller and put into the same concert. And I was telling her, I wish I had a more vivid memory of that. But what I loved was that she and I and Katie, and Laura Packer all went to lunch. And that was the highlight for me, is sitting there in such close proximities to amazing women telling life stories and getting to know each other. And then the next thing I wanted to say is that I was coming through Denver and I was like, hey, I'm going to be in Denver for a couple of days. And she was like, let's go to lunch. And so we met for lunch at this amazing bookstore. And just, it was just, yeah, meant to be. I had lunch, toured the bookstore, talked about stories, talked about books, talked more about life. And I just really appreciate her with her generosity, because we were talking about, I'm also a new storyteller in the field and understanding like how to open that door to fairy tales, because I write my own stories and I tell personal stories, but I don't tell folk tales or fairy tales or things like that. And I'd like to expand my repertoire one day. And she was very, very generous in exploring that idea and option with me. So um, without further ado, Ms. Rachel Ann Harding, thank you so much for coming on with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is quite exciting.
Yeah. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's
Good.
hot. Whenever you're watching this, I hope it's cooler than it is right now.
Mm,
Because it's warm here, but it's a lovely day.
yeah. Very good. Well, let's jump into it. And
Yeah.
Rachel Ann, tell me, why do you tell stories?
I tell stories because for me, it's an instinct. Um, it's something that once I realized that's what I loved, I couldn't do anything else. And I, you know, I had kind of a long road getting to the place that I wanted to be a storyteller. But once I was there, I was there.
You're hooked.
I was hooked.
Hooked. I know, it's very, yeah, it's very mesmer. Like I use that word with Laura, but it's very it entrances you. That's, yeah, it's very, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but
It engages, I think, on so many different levels. And for me, there's that, which stories are the ones that I want to tell? I'll
mm-hmm.
never know. I can read an entire book and find maybe one or two stories, and then I can hear a story that I've set aside and realize I want to tell it. They just it's almost a psychological or imaginary game. There are so many things that engage me as a storyteller, that it's not just performance that I find exciting and fun, but it's the creation and the discovery and the crafting as well that gets me excited.
I love that. Now, how were you first introduced to storytelling as a professional art?
So that was when I turned 28. Becoming a storyteller was not on my mind at all until I was in my last year of college. And I went to Naropa University, which is a Buddhist contemplative college in Boulder, Colorado. And I chose that particular college because initially I wanted to teach. I was a Montessori preschool teacher for a number of years. And in order to become an elementary Montessori teacher, I needed to have a bachelor's. And I wanted to have a lot of different things to study before I started into my teaching career. So I started the interdisciplinary degree at Naropa University, and I studied performance art, psychology, and early childhood education. all of that combined, I was thinking I was going to do a final thesis on emotional intelligence in the arts and children, because
Mm.
I love emotional intelligence and attachment psychology. And I was talking to a friend who is a musician, and she was telling me about one of her shows that she had done. And she was telling me about the crowd and how much she loved it and the energy that was there. She said, "This is what I wanted since I was 9 years old." And when you're getting to the end of college and everybody's question is, "What are you doing next?" I didn't know. Even though I had thought I would go on to teach in the classroom, I was cooling on that. It's a lot of
Mm.
work.
It's a lot of work. As a former classroom
Teachers.
teacher, it's a
Oh,
lot of work.
teachers are incredible. And those who make
Mhm.
it a lifetime work, I have great respect for them. Um, so she told me about this event. She said it was something she wanted to do since she was 9. And I started to sit with that question. What have I wanted to be or do since I was 9 that
Mm.
I have decided just was a foolish dream?
Mm.
And it was like, the mythical bird came and dropped the answer into my lap. It was storytelling. And then I was like, is that an actual profession? And somebody said, up at CU in Boulder, there are storytellers that come and visit every year. You should go see them. And I went to a show with Liz Weir from Northern
Oh,
Ireland, Claire
yes.
Murphy from Ireland, Fergal Lynn, who's also from Northern Ireland, and Lamore Shaponi, who's an Israeli storyteller. And I walked out of there just vibrating. I was like, this is what I want to do. Um, so that was my first introduction. And I went up to Liz Weir afterwards and said, I'd love to have a conversation with you. And
Mhm.
she handed me her card and she said, I have an Airbnb, or I have a hostel up in Northern Ireland. Come and visit me for a month and I'll show you what I do.
Wow. Yes. Oh, I remember us talking about that story too. That's an amazing. And so that's how you began to learn the craft of storytelling, was through Liz.
It completely changed my life. It also, so I went there after I graduated. I went there
Mhm.
for a month, and I would get in the car with Liz in the morning, and I would go to gig after gig after gig with her for almost a month. And it showed me two things. There's work for storytellers, and I love spooky stories because it was all during the month
Mm.
of October.
Wow, that was my introduction to storytelling, was a ghost story. It's the first time
It's
I got on stage to do it.
October is the gateway for storytelling. It's like, that's how you get them.
The veil is very thin. That's interesting. Oh my gosh. So what kind of storyteller are you now? Are you I know you do the podcast, so
Mhm.
you do live things. What else do you do?
So that was where coming back to the United States was somewhat of a shock,
Mm,
because in Ireland, when you say I'm a storyteller, they'll ask you about your gigs and where you tell. And when you say it in America, they'll ask you if you read books to kids.
right. They don't understand.
It's not in the same vocabulary or culture the way it is in European states or
Mm,
European countries. And so when I got back, I was it was a long road of struggling to try to figure out how to make this a full-time thing. And I feel like storytelling is like being, excuse me, in a relationship,
mm,
that I need, it will tell me what it needs, and I can't force anything on it. I have to respect what it needs. So when people would say, oh, you should do personal stories, or you should do hospice work, or you should work with families, gathering the stories from your elders, that's all beautiful and big and wonderful work. But every time I go to my storytelling side and say, is this what we're going to do? It was like, no, we want to tell folk and fairy tales. That's all
mm,
we want to do. So it took me, I've been on this journey now for 7 or 8 years.
mhm,
And most of what I do right now is the work with the Story podcast, and
mhm.
that has its own story. But then it's also working with my friend Cooper Brown. He and I work together as storytellers, especially focusing on events for some of it's all ages and some of it's more adult.
Mm.
The
Yes.
perspective in America has often been that storytelling is for children, and these stories were not written for children.
I know. I have yet to do a children's storytelling thing. I've done open mics in bars. I have done concerts in bars, you know, different, very adult venues. But yeah, I'm not a children's storyteller either.
No, it's well, and there's this level of educating what educating people what storytelling and traditional storytelling is.
Hmm.
And then there's also getting to delve into the dark, or just even the
Hmm.
real life these stories
Right.
have in them. Little Red Riding Hood is pretty terrifying if you really think about it. And I think we also underestimate how much our kids want to hear the dark, you know?
Well, and that's so interesting because I grew up with very little fairy tales and folk stories other than kind of Disney-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And I never when I read them, I never I was like, why what I don't understand this. And I didn't like them at all. I had a visceral repulsion to these stories. And then when I read Women Who Run with Wolves, I understood why. I was like, "Oh, because 'cause they're not trying to entertain you like Disney. They're telling you these are warning tales.
Mm-hmm.
These are real life. This is a personal story that has evolved into this tale to help you navigate this dangerous thing called life."
And they're so clever in that way because you don't know any of the characters, and
Mhm.
yet you know all of the characters. You
Mhm.
know Jack, you know Sleeping Beauty. So many stories are about the danger of marrying a stranger. You know,
Mhm.
stranger danger. Bluebeard or Mr. Fox or a number of other stories all happen because nobody knew who the guy was.
Yeah, it's the archetype kinda thing that we
Hmm.
find. Yeah, most definitely. Um, how do you continue I mean, and I don't know, like, I'm thinking maybe some of these are redundant because I have these questions, but, like, how do you continue to hone your craft of storytelling, and choose stories, as they come along?
So I'm the kind of artist that needs deadlines and goals and events that are happening, or
Mm,
else I can put it off. I don't have to face the uncomfortable parts of crafting and practicing. I have a CD that I've got all the artwork made for it. I just haven't recorded it yet because I don't have to do it. So working with Cooper has been really helpful in the sense that I've had to get a story together so that when we go online or stand up in front of somebody or a group of people who have bought tickets, that I'm giving them their time's worth. Um, so that for me is in some ways what propels me along the path of learning and continuing to hone my craft.
mm,
Some of it is the creation and craft of it lately has been a lot of support with one of my mentors, Janice Del Negro, who, when I heard her storytelling for the first time, I was starstruck.
yeah.
I've heard so many stories and I've loved so many tellers, but when I heard Janice, I was just like, whoa. Every word was chosen, every beat was precise, and it's the difference between casual telling and really knowing how to give your audience the space inside the story to experience for themselves.
Mhm.
It
Yes.
becomes
Well, her name came up actually in my last interview with Elizabeth Ellis, who you
ah
know.
uh-huh.
So, yeah, so I'm looking forward to speaking with Janice, hopefully, if she'll have me. So, I
she's
love that.
she's amazing because she has both this wonderful background in library research, so when we're working together, I can say I've heard the story but I don't know where it is, and she spends like 4 minutes on Google and she's like, there it is.
Ta-da! Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, how do you decide, if well, first, how do you find stories to tell? And then how do you decide if they're right for you to tell or if they speak to you in the way you were talking about?
And it's kind of a gut reaction.
Mhm.
there are some stories, sometimes I'll hear it from another storyteller, and there's kind of this like bubbly feeling of that would just be fun to say out loud. That
Mm-hmm.
would be fun to put in my mouth and spit back out. And then some stories I might choose because I am excited about how it works and how it weaves. Um, so it really is kind of a visceral response. I call it speed dating when you're reading a book.
Ah, I love that.
So I speed date a bunch of stories, and then I make a note about the ones I had a connection with, and give them my number and tell them to call me,
Yeah.
um, and then I'll go back and I'll make notes of the ones and see if they still call me. Usually they get crafted in preparation for an event. When Cooper and I are working together, we might choose something based on stories that we want to develop.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we just recently had two shows, one called The Birds and the Bees. And I had a bees story, and I said, well, I really want to tell that one. So he had to find a bees story that called to him. And then for the birds, it was kind of that same thing. I kept looking for these stories and ended up finding this sweet Irish story about this king and his beloved pet goose.
Oh.
It's like, this is so sweet, and I really want to tell that.
That's amazing. And so and that's how you, I mean, like, how do you know if they're going to be right for the audience kind of thing? So you have this instinct about it, and then you're getting before a group of people. And if it's, and let me put it to you this way, because if you're marketing a concert, you've already
Mhm.
established that. So you're going to draw people to you. But like when you go to venues where you're in a concert like we were, like how do you figure out something that's going to hit a diverse audience, that you may not know who all is there?
Yeah, because in some ways you can do a little bit of research, knowing where they are in the country, the values of that area. Sometimes I'll ask people about their audience. When
Mm-hmm.
I'm invited to do a show, I'll say, how familiar is your audience with traditional storytelling? Because if they're not very familiar, I'll probably stick with simpler stories that, not simple in the sense that they're dumb, but more that have consistent characters that everyone's familiar with,
Right.
Jack,
Mm-hmm.
or a Nasruddin story, or something that just is also grounded in reality. Telling a story about a farmer is a lot more relatable than telling a story about a goose that can talk and hands out its feathers willy-nilly to create wishes. there's
Yeah.
there's kind of levels of storytelling, and so with a less experienced audience, sticking with light and fun and familiar that they can connect to what they already know is really helpful. But with those who are familiar with story, that's when I can say, all right, I want to give them something they haven't heard before. So I
Mm-hmm.
either need to have a new spin on something familiar, or find a story that's not as well known and see if that entices them.
Yeah. Oh, and I just as you were talking about, I was thinking like, oh yeah, the power we wield as storytellers. Like it's an interesting concept, definitely. When you, especially working with traditional tales and fairy tales, how do you then make that story your own? So it's different than the version that it may be very, very mainstream.
With those, some of it is imagery.
Mm.
For
Mm.
for me, it's a lot about imagery. Um, the really traditional, like well-known ones, Cinderella
Mhm.
or Beauty and the Beast, because people already know that framework. I can focus in on different aspects. I have a Beauty and the Beast version called What the Library Saw. And it's that idea that everything is alive. And so the books themselves are alive. And they see the story of Beauty and the Beast unfolding. And I often have this habit of stripping away magic a little bit. I mean,
Mhm.
there's still magic because the books are alive.
Right.
But Beauty herself, she's this feisty gal, and the books are watching her, and they know that she loves them. And for the first time in years, they're being held and touched again. And they notice when she finds a book on poisons, and create something for herself, because, she's not going to be hurt. So I give beauty this sense of like defiance. But then when she falls in love with the beast and she leaves him for the few days, the beast himself takes the poison. And so when she
Wow.
returns to him, that's why he's dying. And the books fall off the shelves to try to help her. And, it ends the same way. But she has to heal him from all of this using the help of the books. So it's a different angle of how you play with that structure.
I'm totally enraptured. I'm totally, I was like, where can I see that? Where can I listen to this? I need to hear it. I need to hear it. Oh my gosh. What techniques do you use to practice your stories? Because I think I'm kind of like you, like I get ready for an event and because it's hard work for me. So
Yeah. So it's changed a little bit over the last year of working with Janice. Janice works a lot from paper.
mm,
And so we actually like write the story out almost line by line. And for me, what I found is I don't say it line by line, but the crafting of it has given me such vivid mental images that I can find my way through the story. It's almost like it's like my sight entering into a story is very dim, but as I begin to describe it and find the beats, I can find my way through the story holding on to imagery.
mm,
um, so it's been helpful, not only because it gives me I know that I have worked with this story from beginning to end. Every piece of it has been examined and cared for, but it also means that when I come back to do it in 6 months, I know I can deliver that story again just as precisely and just as vividly as I did when I first fell in love with it and started working with it.
wow. Well, and you've talked about a couple of your mentors. How do you mentor other people? How do you share that experience?
This was I mean, part of me wants to say I'm not at the place where I can mentor. I fully encourage anybody, but my contribution, I feel like right now, to the storytelling community is the podcast.
Yeah.
um, my style of telling is still growing and it's still finding its feet. So mentoring is not necessarily something I feel confident doing, but I can point towards other tellers and say, if you want to know how to play with language, listen to this person. If you want to know how to play with music, listen to this person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I was fixing to say you were a mentor to me. So like it's possible. You're very generous with your information and the sharing of what you've learned. So I do see that just in that relationship of just talking with you. So yeah. So do you get nervous to perform? And then if you do, like what are some of the things you do and what advice would you give to people who want to tell a story but have a little bit of stage fright?
The first time I got on stage, I had these moments beforehand where mentally I was thinking, what am I doing? I have chosen the wrong thing to do with my life. I can't do, there was just, I was so ready to just walk out. And then afterwards I was like, I can do anything. I'm a hero. But with the stage fright, some of it is reframing, is to say
Mm,
this is excitement and this is an okay feeling, because often we call it stage fright,
mm.
and sometimes it's just excitement. You love these stories that you're about to tell, and you're going to tell them to the people that are your friends. I mean, they must be your friends if they bought a ticket. If your enemies bought a ticket, I think you have a lot of very friendly enemies. So some of it's saying, I'm just really excited.
Mhm.
Sometimes before a show, we all have things and worries in our life that weigh us down and can hold more space in our brains when we're trying to hold a story up front. And so sometimes I will just get a really good friend and I'm going to say, I need to just say everything that is on my mind and I don't need you to respond. I just need you to listen. And so I'll be like,
Mm,
I need to pick up this from the grocery store. My car needs these repairs. I'm thinking about this person. I will give it all to them. And they'll be
mhm.
like, great, thanks. And I'll be like, I'll see you after the show.
Yay. Oh, I love that. I love that. So it doesn't take up space
hmm
while you're doing this. Oh, that's an amazing. So what techniques do you use to practice your stories?
I so first I start with the writing process. I'll read
Mhm.
it. I'll try to find a number of different versions, and then I'll sit down and I'll write it out.
Mm.
And then I'll draft it again. And then I'll start the process of putting it into my mouth. The first line is so helpful to get you started. Like having that first line can move you into a story, and it has to move you and like the 50 other people that are listening. So it has to be that kind of good line, and it can be super simple. There once was a farmer who lived in China who tended bees. You know, simple to get you there. But then finding the beats and then practicing it over and over again. Just sitting there and talking to yourself. I've taken to talking to the plants in the garden. I will occasionally mumble to myself, and my partner will say, "Did you say something?" I'm like, nope, just telling stories.
Just just telling stories to myself here.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Um, do you have a story that's in your repertoire that you look forward to finding an opportunity to tell?
There are a few of them that I relate to as like ones I love to tell. And
Mhm.
I call them a little bit, they're my medicine.
Mm.
So they nurture me when I get to tell them.
Mhm.
And it's a tricky balance, because there's some medicine that's good for you and everybody else, and it brings them along on the story, and it's something that everybody can enjoy. And then there's medicine that not everybody's going to appreciate. Some of my good medicine stories is the Corpse Bride, um,
Mm.
which is a beautiful story about heartbreak and loss and love, and corpses coming back from the dead. And or the Blue Bowl, which I told at the Texas Storytelling Festival, about a man who gets to experience life as a woman for a period of time. And then there are ones that are my medicine, where it's a story about death, and the end just kind of rips your heart out and sets it down on the table and says enjoy. So you have to be careful with an audience, because they trust you and where you're going with them, and if they're ready for that kind of ah at the end of a story, that's great. But if they're not, you don't want to take them there.
Yeah. That is actually one of the biggest and best pieces of advice that I ever got when telling difficult stories is that whatever you do, you have to make sure you land your audience safely. That they're
hmm
not worried about you, they're not worried about the future, they're not worried about themselves. I mean, have it food for thought, but that you have to safely put them back into their place when you
hmm
take them on a very difficult ride with a difficult story. So
hmm
that's amazing. Um, what do you see? What kind of stories do you see coming out of all the things that we're experiencing 2020, which you can pick because there's a lot going on this year?
There's so much this year. I think there's a lot of beautiful, incredible personal stories that are coming out of this,
Mm, I do
and
too.
people realizing, I think how strong they are, and how much they can survive, and feeling that not only can they survive, but they do make a difference in their community just by being at home and being kind and gentle to themselves. And I think storytelling, the face of storytelling, is changing here in the United States. And in traditional ways, the traditional storytelling is changing here in the United States in a way that I'm excited about. Um, because when I started looking around, schools weren't hiring, and they still aren't hiring traditional storytellers. They have a lot that they have to put into a school year, and it'd be lovely. It would be nice to have a storyteller come and tell traditional folk and fairy tale, but it's not necessary.
Mm.
And in balancing what is necessary and what is nice, we are in a very let's do what's necessary time.
Yeah. And see, and then my understanding of storytelling is growing to the part where it's like, hello, wake up. This is so necessary.
Yeah.
This is not, this is necessary. Like, and like this, um, the idea that, storytelling creates that emotional intelligence that you spoke about.
Yeah.
And that is empathy is something, connection, seeing
Yeah.
yourself in an experience that you may never have had, just by identifying with a character is just so necessary to me
And
right
it's
now.
really the antidote to bullying. For a very
Mm-hmm.
long time, schools were looking for anti-bullying campaigns, and now, or teachers and leaders, and now they're saying, let's bring in empathy coach. Let's bring in people who can teach and support children in developing empathy, who can learn to experience what another person is experiencing and say what they're needing. There's a book on my list of things to do that I am working on getting to. But the book, the title is Stop Reading to Your Kids.
Mm.
And then some kind of subtitle about the importance of oral storytelling, because really the best place for kids to learn about emotion in a safe place is through story. Whether
Mm.
it's family stories about how so and so fell down the well, and it was, I don't know who falls down wells anymore, but somebody
Yeah.
somebody got lost or hurt and they were scared, but then everything turned out okay. Or the traditional stories about a huff and puff and blow your house in. All of these times spent with mom and dad, or any caregiver, listening to these stories allows them to learn and grow their mirror neurons of emotions inside of a story that's safe, can be
Mm-hmm.
stopped at any time it becomes too alarming, can be ratcheted up anytime it comes too boring. There's so much space in there to grow and learn emotion. And I think every parent would find so much more um, support in if they took time and had time to sit and tell stories with their children.
Yeah. Which this gives us an opportunity to do right
Yeah.
now. Yeah. So are you part of any kind of story circles or groups or associations that you have ongoing connection and mentorship with?
Not really.
Yeah.
I'm part of NSN, which is lovely. I love going to the NSN conferences.
Mm-hmm.
It's like going to a family reunion.
And that's the
You know?
National Storytelling Network.
Yes, the National
Yes.
Storytelling Network. Um, I've been there now 4 or 5 times, and it's every time I go, it's like cousins and aunts and uncles, and oh, it's very exciting. But it's difficult now in this time to connect. There are some story circles in this area, but again, in this time, there aren't any live ones. I spend so much time on the computer
Computer.
that I pick and choose how much I can really do during the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell me a memory that you had of the Texas Storytelling Festival when you were there.
There are two memories that really jump out at me. One was Adam Booth playing and singing. Um, he has this little squeeze box, and he was singing about his home state. And I don't want to say the wrong state, so I'm just going to say singing about his home state.
West Virginia.
Thank you.
Yes.
West Virginia. So he was singing kind of the state anthem, and
Mm.
it was just beautiful. And then he put Texas in there, and you could see the whole audience be like, yes. And I was like, wow. And then the other one was Sheila Arnold,
Mm.
um, telling a story about her son having an encounter with the police.
Mm-hmm.
And, in
That had just
2018,
happened the night before.
yeah,
Yes,
it
that she was
was,
she was in the Sunday morning Sacred Tales concert, And that had just happened to her son, and she'd found out about it the night before. And translating that immediately, I mean, I was in awe of how she did that.
It was, you know, in 2018, I think that for a very long time, we've all been like, yeah, things are bad. Things are difficult for other people. You know, the people of color, yeah, they've got a little bit tougher, but you know, what are you going to do? I'll
Mm-hmm.
support them where I can. You know, there was so much of a more casual attitude towards it. And I'm as much at fault of that as well. So hearing her talk about it and hearing her bring that to life landed it in a very different way, in a way that was very powerful, and again, like, shifted me towards, how do I become a better ally? How do I talk about this? How do
Mm-hmm.
I examine myself for prejudice and racism?
Mm-hmm.
um,
And that's something too that I feel, I can't speak to this because I don't know, but when I have a difficult story to tell, there's a process time.
yeah.
So the fact that this wasn't the first time this has happened, for her to be able to tell that story with such poise and composure, she had processed this kind of experience through her lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing that then affect her children, like,
Mm-hmm.
it just, that's what really hit home to me, was like, this isn't the first time that this has happened to Sheila or her family. This isn't,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and she's, yeah, it was very powerful for me as well.
It was. It was, and that story to bring us into somebody else's experience in such a way that um, makes gives us a space to relate to it personally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know what it feels like to always worry about my family walking out the door, but when she told it, for a moment I saw it, and I could feel it
Mm-hmm.
the way she feels it,
Yeah.
or similar to the way she feels it. You know, it was powerful.
Right. I mean, yeah, you understand it the best way that you can without actually living it. I mean, that's, I think people dismiss that a lot about, oh, I know how you feel. Like,
Right.
some people can experience that. I mean, not, I haven't had that firsthand experience, but like, I understand that as a mother of a daughter. I mean, I can understand that as just a person of, you know, it's available to us.
Mm-hmm.
It's available to us if we choose to share and
And
connect with
yeah,
somebody.
but stories need to be told.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Well, the next question I have is, what story do you want to tell, or about storytelling? But I really want you to tell me the story about Story Podcast.
I can tell you that
It's like,
story.
you can pick another one too, but I'm like, I really want to hear about that, because I love Story Podcast. And I love the stories, but I also love the sponsorships of who sponsors Story Podcast. And I actually look forward to that just a little bit more than I look forward to the story.
No, and they're fun every time. So I'll give you that story. And I don't know if I've ever told the story of the Story podcast, kind of with all the different things that contributed to it having its own life and where it is now today. Um, so when I said I'm going to be a storyteller, I very quickly learned that income is still very important, even if you're not being hired to go into schools. So I took a lot of odd jobs. I was doing child sitting, I was doing proofreading, I was doing house cleaning. And so I had 2 houses that I cleaned, about 10 hours a week of work there. And I would stick in my headphones and I'd listen to podcasts. And I was looking for a podcast to hear other traditional storytellers. Um, I couldn't afford all of their CDs, so I thought, well, maybe there's a podcast where I can listen to them. I
Hmm.
couldn't find one, and so little seed was planted there. Okay, I should make a podcast. But you know how things are. If you don't have a deadline or, you know, a time to start something, you don't do it. So the fire that lit everything off was I was dating this guy, and he had all these ideas of how I was going to, you know, make it as a storyteller. And when he realized kind of how difficult it was, he said, well, maybe you should just quit for a little bit, and you should go to software engineering school, and you should learn to code. And, you know, you should code, and then you'll get a really good job, and you'll make a bunch of money, and you can do storytelling on the side. And there's a part of me that took deep offense to this. I was like, I would never do such a thing. And it was almost like it got me going, where I was like, I'll show you. I'm going to start a podcast.
I love it. Lit that fire, baby.
I know, it really like propelled me. And you know, I have a day job now. I do storytelling on the side, but I have enough of storytelling that I don't feel like it's a side hobby. It's my passion.
Right. Yeah.
So I started the podcast. I reached out to a number of different tellers. Early contributors were Oni Lasana and Lynn Ford and Donna Washington, Simon Brooks. You know, I reach out to them and I would say, do you have any stories? And for me, I'm approaching my heroes.
Yes.
I'm approaching people that I've seen, and I'm just like, oh God, you know.
Like I'm approaching you like I was introduced to you with this Story podcast. I know how you feel.
Yeah. So I was like, so thank you. And they would be like, sure. And they sent me so much material, so incredibly generous. And it got the podcast started. So for the first, like that was in 2016. I started it, launched the first episode, didn't really know what I was doing. But I knew the main thing was I wanted to feature other storytellers from around the world. And I was going to do these fairy tale sponsors, which were these fake sponsors. They have been there since the beginning. So I started the first season. It was every other week, and I had it in a season. And then I took a break to try to figure things out. The second season I was running out of like filler between the storytellers. I'm like, how often do I introduce Lynn Ford? Like, they know who she is if they've been listening to the podcast at all. How much can I really say? So if you listen to those first episodes, I kind of wander around a little bit or try to make these elegant intros. But by the second season, I figured out these real life fairy tales, where squirrels return your keys or cats talk to you, you know, these odd events that just have a little bit of tall tale and fairy tale in them. And splitting that up between there gave me a little bit of opportunity to work on my own storytelling. But it gave some filler to the episode. So you are almost getting 3 stories per episode. And then I sat down with a friend and I said, how do I make this big? How do I help people to find it? And he gave me some SEO tips, but then he said, you need to do this weekly. Like, if you want people to show up, you need to get it out weekly. So I started doing it weekly and about died. It's so much work.
It is.
So throughout this whole thing, Simon has always been super supportive and sent me work and listened to stuff and, you know, helped me figure things out. And so I approached him and I'm like, this is my baby. You know, it's my baby. And I think I'd be all right with you hosting it if you'd like to host. And he did a beautiful job, and it took a little bit off my plate so I could start focusing on it more. And so, and then about a year later, I asked my friend Isabel Hauser from Switzerland, who I also knew as this lovely, she's got this gorgeous voice and this way of putting words together that I was like, so when she agreed to be a host, that's lifted enough off that it can continue weekly, couple breaks during the year.
Yeah.
But it's brought so many storytellers, hopefully, to people out there who have never heard them.
Yes.
And it's grown from a couple hundred listeners to like, we average about 3,400 a week. Which
Congratulations.
I know it's not like Tim Ferriss podcast huge, but
They got to start somewhere. And
I
it's,
love my listeners. I love the listeners. They're not mine. They're the podcast listeners, but I
yeah,
love the listeners.
yeah. Well, and it is, I mean, like everything starts somewhere. And it is, I found it. It's interesting because I was starting storytelling and I wanted to find stories because I didn't grow up with traditional stories. We grew up with family stories, and that's how I
Mhm.
found you. And so like you definitely were, yeah, and I have recommended to everybody that asks or listen or wants to know. So yeah, it's phenomenally produced. I would just like to tell you.
Thank you.
Like it is, the content is incredible, but the production is exquisite. So,
I appreciate that because not like again, if you listen to those first episodes, it's kind of like she had no idea.
yeah.
I have produced this since the beginning on GarageBand.
Well,
So Simon has tried so hard, tried his level best to get me to like upgrade to a more professional editing suite. Maybe that'll happen.
but see, you're like me. Like I'm not a computer person. I'm not. That is. I mean, just I can record it on Zoom and upload it to YouTube. And
Mhm.
it's like so. That's yeah. I'm like if I wanted to be a software engineer, I would have gone to computer school.
Exactly. But
Exactly.
instead, we start podcasts.
That's right. And about the necessary art of storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most definitely. Well, tell me, Miss Rachel Ann Harding, who do you think I should ask to interview next?
Such a hard question. Um, okay, I've got two in mind.
Okay.
Cooper Brown.
Mm-hmm.
He's a young man in storytelling. I mean, he's like 4 months younger than me, so he's a young man. um, but he really thinks so deeply about storytelling, and about the art and the craft. And he thinks it's so helpful having him as a storytelling partner. He's been one of the reasons I've been able to keep going the way I have. So Cooper.
Yes.
The other
Mm.
one would be Carolina Quiroga Stoltz.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
She
Yes.
is she's a Latina storyteller who also has a podcast and tells stories that I have never heard before from her cultural background. And
Hmm.
she's lovely, and I would suggest her as well, because I'm sure she has so many interesting things. She really comes from a solid story filled culture and community,
Yes.
that is wonderful.
And watching her tell a story live is like getting a story and modern dance.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, like her physicality of telling a story is, yeah,
It's
just like,
amazing.
whoa. Yeah. So, oh, great. Well, I look forward to, yeah, to that. And I just appreciate you so much. And it is so good to see you again, my friend.
It's
Even if
good
it's
to see
online, I can't wait
you.
to see you in person.
Yes. If you're ever coming through Denver again, let me know.
Definitely. I will. Well, there's a track between me and the Pacific Northwest, Texas and the Pacific Northwest. So I'm sure I'll come through Colorado again.
Yeah.
Anything else? Any like closing things that you thought of about storytelling or yourself as a storyteller?
Just keep telling stories.
Yeah, I
It'll,
advocate that as well for the people. And there's going to be more information about how you can find Story podcasts,
mhm.
how you can get in touch with Miss Rachel Ann Harding to book a gig or to talk about stories in the description box. And again, thank you, Rachel Ann Harding.
Thank you. This has been delightful.
And my name is Shane Larango, and thank you for listening.